Connecting to cloud server. Okay. So we're in 3s and 4s, which I think is just like a great sweet spot to be in for the most part. So we're going to move on today to something a little bit different, but still has some kind of connection. Okay. That being said, you still have that Redux project where you're going to try to add Redux to that already created project. So definitely keep working on that outside of class. We may have some class time at some point to also work on that, but the expectation on those 2-week projects or so is for you to get those done outside of class. In the meantime, we are going to start talking about Context API, and then later in the week, we're going to talk about Redux Toolkit. So we'll come back to the Redux. We're going to take a little pause with new like Redux Central information because we really do have the bulk of it here. And you can do your project in here. Today we'll talk about Redux Toolkit. We'll work on the lab for the Context API. And we'll work on the Context API lab. And then later on, we can go ahead and move into that Redux Toolkit. Are we good? Makes sense with what we are doing? Okay, so the first thing I want to introduce to you about Context API is that it's awesome. Okay, it's like super, super cool. Is it going to replace Redux, you might ask? Not yet. Okay, real answer, not yet. For small projects, you could probably definitely get away with using Context API over Redux. That being said, for larger projects and things with frequent updates to your application state, you will want to use Redux. It is not made for constant, quick updates of the store. Not yet. Not at this point in time, okay? Any questions on that before I start diving into it a bit?
Yeah, quick question. Can you,
yes.
What is Context API? It's like a library.
Oh, great question. I mean, that's what we're going into. So what is Context API? Context API is something that is built into React. So we are back in React world right now. We are just lengthening. She, are you calling me? Or is that just your phone? Oh yeah, I think that was just your phone. I thought, okay, it doesn't matter what I thought. Context API is provided by React. So this is something that you can also add as like more like I know React, I know React hooks, I know React context, right? So this is really going a little bit more in depth on unleashing some more power that React has. So this is going to be cool. So when should I use React Context API? You should use React Context API, and I'm going to write it in the chat app here. When you're thinking about, traditionally when you're thinking about global like variables, okay? So anything that you would want access to pretty much on almost a global scale is a pretty good thing that you would want to put into your Context API. This is essentially the things that you'll be storing in your application store, to use a little bit of Redux talk. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to start kind of going into this. Okay, so let's share desktop 2. And you can all see desktop 2. Nod if you can, or let me know if you can't. I guess is even better. Let me make sure I can have access to seeing all the everything that I need to see. Okay. All right. So we've got our React app here running. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of all of this junk. And I'm going to show you just the most basic use of our context. So how do I make a new context? Well, it's built into React. So the first thing that I can do is I can import, instead of with React, I'm also going to go ahead and import create context. Okay, yeah, pretty fair. And outside of this component, I am going to go ahead and create a context. So I'm going to go ahead and say export const this variable, and let's call this. Let's just call this context for now, just for fun. And I'm going to make this a capital context, and I'm going to call the function that we just imported from our React app, and I'm going to invoke create context. So far, not too painful. So this also takes in a optional argument. I could pass something in here. I could say like string, let's say. Now, why would I do this? This is good for anything that's not wrapped in my context. So let me show you something. So let's go ahead and make a component. So I'm going to make a folder called components. And I'm going to just create a little file, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to call this counter for now, counter.js. Okay, and so in my counter, I'm going to import import React from React. I'm going to have a const counter. Doesn't take in any arguments for now. It's just going to return some JSX, or I'll say I'll have an H1 that just has a counter. Let's go ahead and export this. Okay, this is just a normal thing. So if I have something in here right now, I can go ahead and access that. So let's import this into here for now, just so I can go ahead and say counter, just so we have it. Okay, this is so we can visually see what's in that component. And I'm going to go ahead and import use context. Oops, this should be in curly braces. Okay, so I'm importing use context, right? So we've seen create context, where we created a new context, and I have a use context. This is a, what do we think this is? What does use context sound like? Write in the chat what use context sounds like. Okay, thank you, Marvin. Who's Steve McQueen? Can people please keep their real name? It's a little, otherwise I won't know who's who. We got Jay, Siham. Everyone is saying hook. We don't need no hooks, Deja says. We definitely do. Kong says use selector, hook. I'm getting lots of Captain Hooks now. I like that, Sin. Great. Okay, so you're all right. For most of you, not all of you. It sounds like a hook. People said use selector. I guess they're talking about like what it probably does conceptually, and so that's pretty good. That's just about right. But it sounds a lot like a hook because what starts with use. So it is a hook. This is a React hook, which means this can only be used in a functional component because this is a hook. And hooks don't work in class-based components. I know it's been a while since we've done class-based components. It's just something to keep in mind. So let's also go ahead and import our context. So this is coming from here. We exported a variable called context, and we created this context. So let's go ahead and import that. So context from /app. And I am going to just make a quick variable. I'm going to call this const. Let's say that context. And I'm going to call use context. And I'm going to pass in the context to which I wish to use. So in this case, it's context. Lots of the words context here. Okay, and I'm going to console log what we get back. Okay.
Question,
So,
aren't you just gonna get the word string?
that's right. Very good, Henry. I'm trying to open up my console here. And we get just this word string, as Henry pointed out, right? This is the context. It's pretty not interesting, to say the least, right? We created a variable called context, capital C there. We created our context, passed in a starting value. And over here, we just said we want to use the context and imported it. And we get back our context, which is the same thing that we said that we wanted. Okay, so this doesn't seem very nifty. And it's really not. It's pretty good for testing purposes mostly, which we don't know much about yet. But this is something to be aware of. But since I'm not going to use this context for testing or any purposes of the such, I am going to go ahead and just invoke it without anything. Okay. And so, and here we should have undefined because there's nothing in our context. So very much like Redux, we have this provider relationship we have. And so this context here actually comes with something. This is kind of a high order component of sorts. So I can go ahead and in here, and I could say something like context dot provider, right? That should look a little bit familiar to our Redux days. Now, anything in here, okay, so this provider takes in one prop called value, always. Passed in JSX, and now we have something we can do in here. So let me show you a little bit of an example. So let's say I have a use state that I also want here. And I have some state of a number. So I'm going to say const, I'll call it count and set count. And this is our use state, and we'll start our count at 0. Now, I can go ahead and pass inside of here, I could pass our count. So now I actually have a piece of information here. So I have a count. And in here, instead of taking out my context, I'm going to go ahead and just call this count. And let's go ahead and say so. So we'll say 11H3, and we can say count is count. Okay, so now this has access to this, which we're getting from here. So let's go ahead and see, and we see our count is 0. Interesting. Interesting.
Hold on. Can you go over that again?
I can. So in our app.js here, I'm creating a new context. This just creates the context. Now, anywhere that I want to have access to what is currently inside of our provider of that context, I put inside of it. I just very much like how our provider for Redux wrapped our whole app. This is wrapping whatever I want to have access to what's inside of this value property. And so the way I can do that and actually access it is to use context, to import the context, and to go ahead and say use context, context, count. So let's add on to this. Let's have an increment and a decrement, shall we? So let's say we have an increment. So I'm going to make a function called increment. And all increment is going to do is set count to our count, plus 1, right? That should look familiar. And I'll have a const decrement, which is just going to set our count to our count minus 1. Okay, so let's say I want to have a separate component to actually go ahead and update this piece of state. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that component. So I'm going to say, let's create a new file, and let's call this counter updater. I don't know, something like that. And we'll import React from React. We'll say const counter updater. Doesn't take in any arguments. I have an extra arrow there. And we will, sorry?
Is the count the what was that thing you just had wrapped around in the counter?
Here you're talking about?
Yeah, the context provider. Is it working like a wrapper?
Yep. This is 100% working like a wrapper. So anything inside of here will have access to anything that I put inside of here.
Corey, would you mind going to that counter.js component for a quick second, please?
Sure.
So basically, we could just call count wherever we want, whenever we want, by using. Okay, cool, got it.
At the moment, yes. So we're gonna, if it hasn't completely clicked, just hang tight because we're still seeing the same thing again, but just in a different example, but it's still the same material. So we have our create context here. We're calling it context for now. We are creating this context provider, which is going to provide this information, our value information, to anything inside of here. So let's go ahead and make a counter updater, which is only going to have 2 buttons. So I'm going to say button, and this is going to be increment. Button over here will be decrement. Let's just make sure it looks right. Okay, so we've got our increment and our decrement, and they currently do absolutely nothing, right? So the reason they don't do anything is because it doesn't say to do anything. But really what we want is to use these functions here. So how do we pass these in? Well, instead of just passing a number as my value, I could instead actually pass maybe an object where my count points to count, my increment points to increment, and my decrement points to decrement. So now what's changed? Well, one, we're going to get an error because it's going to complain about objects are not valid as React children. So objects aren't valid as React children. That's because we're just taking count here. Because use context here. When I invoke this, count now looks like an object. See if I can get it to refresh nicely for me. Okay, we hit our debugger, and we can take a look at what count is. And we see, okay, count is this object now, where we have count, increment, and decrement. Well, I can do object destructuring because I've done that a lot of times. So I'm going to go ahead and destructure count, out of this object. Okay, so we go back here, and now that should fix that first problem. This is just like old errors. Still just running through them. Okay. I'm just gonna do the incognito thing. That seems to work better sometimes. Okay, so we're back to having our count. So let's also now figure out a way to get increment and decrement out of our context here. Okay, so I want you to try. It's okay if you don't get it, but I'm going to give everybody 5 minutes to figure out if they can connect their counter update with these functions. Okay, that's your first step. You have till 7:30. And I can push too, so you can just pull and be ready. Okay, all right there, Code Ninjas. In the nonverbal feedback, go ahead and give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, or a clap if you're in the middle, like so I can see how you did on this exercise. You can find them in the more area. I'm getting some yes and no's. Okay. Try to do the thumbs up, thumbs down, clap in the middle. Let's take a look. We've got 14 people who have participated. Make that 18. The numbers are getting hard for me. This looks good. Okay. Okay, so mostly thumbs down and maybes. Okay, cool. Well, we can work with that. So let's go over it. I'm going to clear all answers. Thank you. Okay, so, well, how do we access these increments? How do we access things from in here? Okay, well, we go to our counter updater. We're going to need to import use context. I'm going to go ahead and import the context that I'm going to be using. So in this one, I called it context. And it's in our app, oops, from /app. And I can go ahead and destructure this. So I can go ahead and const increment, decrement from use context and pass in the context to which I wish to receive from. So I called this context. Now I can just go ahead and add my on-click listeners. On-click, I want to increment. On-click, I want to decrement. Okay, so hopefully that will work. Let's go ahead and check. Already hitting a debugger. Where is that debugger? I don't really want to be using it. Okay, go ahead and remove the debugger. Get our quick refresh here. And we hit. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I just had to refresh it. Okay, so when we click plus, it gets incremented. And when we click minus, it gets decremented. So it looks like it's working pretty well. So let's go over again what's happening here. We are in our app.js. We are creating a new context. In this case, we're calling it context. Maybe it would be better to call it counter provider or something like that. But for now, we're just calling it context. We are then making it a provider by saying .provider. We are passing the values. And in this case, it's an object with the key count pointing to the count that we're taking from our app state. Increment, a function we're taking from our app. Decrement, another function we're taking from our app component. Now, inside of our provider, we are providing to all of these children components whatever is inside of here. And we can access them by using use context and importing the context that we wish to use. This is object destructuring. We're taking the whatever the key of count is from whatever this evaluates to. This will be assigned its value. And in our counter updater, we're taking out the increment and the decrement from the object we get back from using context. We're then just adding our classic event listeners onto our buttons. And when this one's clicked, we're firing the function increment. And when this one's clicked, we're firing the function decrement. Can I get any questions?
For some reason, when I did all of that and it's telling me that it can't destructure property count of object as it is undefined. And I was like coding along and I don't know what's happening.
Okay. So let's take a look at that. This seems like an interesting.
I'm
Bug?
sure.
Exact error as Marvin.
You're getting the same error feed?
Yeah, for it's like line 5 of.
Okay. So Marvin, why don't you go ahead and share your screen?
Okay.
And let's take a look and see what difference between what I wrote and what you wrote, and we can find that bug.
Got
Did
it.
you download Redux by any chance?
No, I
We don't
just
need
did React.
Redux.
Yeah. So can you guys see my screen?
So you have counter and counter update,
Yeah, I figured.
set count, use state, increment, set count, count plus one, count. Okay. This looks good.
And
Okay,
then
let's go ahead to your counter update where you are importing. Can I see that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Use context, import context from our app. Are you exporting? Hang on, can you go back to the other one?
This one here. I probably am not.
No, you are. You
I am.
are exporting. Export
Okay.
const.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, let's go back. Okay. This looks pretty good.
And then here, this is where the error was happening from on line 4.
It's actually happening on line number 2. You are not importing that correctly. That needs curly braces around it.
Oh, right. Okay. That's probably.
Yeah, I made the same mistake.
Yeah. And that probably, let me just check. Okay. Yeah, that fixed it. All right. That fixed
Okay.
it. All right. Thanks, Corey.
No problem. So I'm going to take back over.
Yeah.
So you can see my screen, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions that aren't personal debugs in that case?
So
counter update.
Okay, I'll start with Henry. I heard Henry.
okay, so basically, if this is like you said, mentioned earlier, it's a higher component function, right? So if we're trying to grab any, I don't know if it's props or it's props, right? We're grabbing the props.
Well, it's not props. If I were passing props down, it would look like I would be saying count is equal to count. That would be me passing props.
Okay.
This is me not passing props. So the benefit to that is that if there's something I need to thread very deep, I don't need to be doing that. I don't need to be doing any prop threading. I'm specifically pulling from this context or this almost application state in this sense. This is really good for things that are global, like maybe like a user that's currently logged in. Maybe lots of components need to know about that, or a theme, like what theme my app is in. Is it in dark mode or is it in light mode? What language? Are we in Japanese or are we in English? Right? What is the user selected? And that's really where these start to play. Probably obviously wouldn't do this with like a counter app. It'd be, it's a very like fictional example.
So, Corey,
Yes.
basically, like the way, so like the fact that you have the value in the context provider, that's just so instead of like having a component with the function and calling it on click, you're putting everything in the app.js, and in that provider, we can call the values from there into other components to make our function happen.
That's right. We can go ahead and call the context with use context to go ahead and grab whatever we want out of the context. Now, I will say that having this all in app seems a little bit sloppy to me. Okay? So instead of that, I'm going to restructure my app just a touch. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm going to call this providers. This is where I'm going to keep any of my providers. Inside of here, let's go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to call this counter provider.js. And inside of here is where I'm going to actually create this context instead. So let me show you what I mean. I am going to cut this out. So really, I would cut it. I'm going to just comment it out because for us, so you have it in your notes, but I would cut that. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and make it in here, I could call this anything. So I'm going to call this counter context because I might have more than one context in my application. So this would allow me to know which context I'm actually using. Context name itself is a little bit broad. Going to import React from React as well as my create context. Okay. Now, inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and make a wrapper component. So I'm going to say const, and I'm going to call this counter provider. Provider. This is going to take props. Those props are just going to be the children of anything inside of this. This is going to be my high order component. You'll see what I mean in a second. And essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rip everything that was in here. So I would cut this as well, but for you, I'll just comment it out. I will paste it into here. I should add use state. Okay, so I'm just moving things over here. And instead of what I want to return is just this provider. So I'm going to call this counter context, right? Remember, this is coming from right here, dot provider. I'm going to pass the same thing in as before, my value, which will be my object with count, increment, and decrement. And I'm not going to do anything in here except for let it just render its children, which is going to be props.children. This is, again, something that's built into React. Children are referred to as anything inside. These are the children to this provider. And I'm going to go ahead and export default, my counter provider. So what's changed? I've created a wrapper component that deals with its own context and isolates its own information here and uses the counter provider here. So what changes in our app? Instead of using any of this, I'm going to comment this out because we won't need that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and import our counter provider. Counter provider from /providers/counter provider. And I'll wrap everything in that. Counter provider. Whoops. Like so.
Are you gonna remove use state from the line 1?
Sure. Good idea. All right, so this is how I would update this. This is a little bit cleaner. I think we still are gonna have this crash. I don't know why this always gets moved. And that crash is that I no longer have context. Instead, what do I have? In here, instead of importing context, what should I be importing?
Counter provider.
That's right. I should be importing, well, I should actually, what context? Counter provider is what wraps it, my mistake.
Counter context, yeah.
Our counter context is actually the context we want. So now I'm going to go ahead and import counter context from providers. So I'll say /providers/counter provider. And this will go here instead. Not much change. And we're going to go ahead and make that same update here. And go ahead and make this our context as well. Okay, and now our app should still work the same as always, where we plus to get plus and minus to get minus. But now life is just a little bit cleaner. Our app looks like the same way it's always looked, where we're just having our components and we're not dealing with a bunch of baloney logic that we shouldn't really have to jam into our app. Instead, what we're doing is we create our provider where we still get our context. This time I'm naming our context with a little bit better naming conventions. This is with the idea that maybe we're going to have more than one context in our application. We invoke create context to go ahead and create this new context. And then I am actually making my component. This one always will take in props because this is going to be a wrapper component. I'm getting my state. I'm creating a couple functions to update that state. And then I am returning my counter context, which is coming from line 3, dot provider. This is what's built into a React Context API. Value always has to be value. And then I am passing in what I want to be available to anyone who's using counter context. And I'm just going to go ahead and render the props.children. So in our app, we can go ahead and take counter provider and just wrap the things that we want to have from our counter provider inside of that. And those items themselves can go ahead and use the context, but this time they're getting from counter context, which is also coming from that provider file that we're using. Okay, what do we think of this?
It's confusing.
Confusing. Okay.
I think it's like mad quick, and I like it.
Okay, cool.
I feel like in a way it's like the only way I could think about it for it to work for me is like in the providers we're basically just setting up functions and then we're calling them from there into our components, right?
That's pretty much right. Yeah. So it is actually simpler than Redux. That's the nice thing, but it's not as great for complete application state management. What we're going to be doing here is we see our app. I think Deja has to see the app. We're just importing this counter provider. Our counter provider is what's holding the state that we want to share with any components inside of our provider. And then in the other places that we're using those, we just go ahead and do use context and counter context. So let me show you one of the reasons why hooks are so cool. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this class counter.js. And inside of here, I'm going to create our classic class that we used to make. So I'm going to call this class counter. I think I have to import React / component from React, right? This is like, it's been a minute. So the way we could get things before with this, there was 2 ways when we're dealing with classes. I'm less concerned that you remember this. I'm more concerned that you just know that this exists. So if you ever do see it in the wild, you're not like, what? This is more like, oh, this is how they used to write context. So one of the ways you can do it is we could go ahead and, how do I do this? I could import, I'd still have to import our context. So I'm going to import counter context from / provider / counter provider. And in here in my render, I could go ahead and say const, and I could say context type. Oh no, sorry. You'd have to go like this: static context type. You always had to write this, and then I could go ahead and say counter context.
Oh, Corey, Siham said there's an extra L on line 1.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. And so from my context type, I still have those things available. So I'm gonna go ahead and just make a quick div. I'll make my H1 that says class counter, and this is gonna have my H3 and say class count is, and this would be context type dot count. Okay, and let's go ahead and import this into our app here. So I'll put this inside of our provider, where I'll say class counter. Why is that not working? That should work. Let me see here. Oh, I had to do this. I'm sorry. I had to do that before the render. I had to do it up here. And then I have, and then I have this dot. Okay, hang on. So context type is not, I think it's actually this dot context now. Sorry. I don't write like this. Dot count. I think it's this. If this isn't it, I don't care. Okay. And so we're still able to increment and decrement our counts, but this is the way it used to have to be written. This is one of the ways it could be written. Not the greatest user experience, but not bad. However, let's go ahead and build a second context. So we're going to come back to this, and we will see that later. Your task, your mission, if you choose to accept this, I'm gonna break you out into breakout groups. And what I want you to do is I want you to create another context provider for a small to-do app. You should be able to add to-dos or delete to-dos by ID. Okay, you can start with just adding a to-do. Have a component to display the to-dos, and one to be the form. Okay, so I want you to follow the same pattern that you followed previously for your to-do. For the ID, use the package uuid v4. It should look, oh, I don't have a good way of copying that. Okay, here, I'll just write the line. Import v4 as uuid v4. And then from uuid, like that. Okay, and then you can just go like uuid v4 and invoke that, and that would give you a brand new ID. Hopefully you're looking at the chat. Okay, so you're going to be broken into groups. I want you to create another context in the same application that is provides a small like to-do app. It's going to provide to-dos. So provide to-dos, add, and remove. And I will definitely push. Thank you, Deja, for the reminder. Okay, I will break out those groups. Now we're going to spend, let's spend a half hour doing that in the groups. So I'm going to make, there's going to be 3 to 4 people per room, maybe 2 in some situations, because you might end up with John or Jenya. Okay, and let me see, make sure there's enough people. Yep, and let's go ahead and do this for a half hour. Are there any questions before we start? Sam, I see your mouth moving, but you're on mute.
No, I don't have any question. Thank you.
Oh, okay, no problem. It says we are creating this on the React app we are using now. Yeah, you can definitely, thanks Jay for that question. You can definitely use the React app now. I like the idea of having a couple of different contexts in the one app. Because maybe in real life you would have one for theme and another one for language or something. That's pretty normal. Any other questions? All right, great. I'll be bouncing around. But if for some reason I don't see you, I'll see you in a half hour, okay? See you soon. I'm recording, okay? And go over to my screen share, desktop 2, and let's go ahead and talk about this. So the first thing that hopefully you thought to do is to make a new provider. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this to-dos provider. To-dos provider. Now in my to-dos provider, I'm going to go ahead and import my React as well as my create context, because I'm going to be creating a brand new context that we can have access to so that we can see things. I'm also know ahead of time I'm going to want to use state, because this is going to hold, this is where all of my to-dos are going to live. So I'm just going to make that now. I mentioned about a package. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now too. I'm going to npm install UUID, and I'm going to import that right now here. Just say, I'm just going to call that v4 from UUID. Okay, and let's go ahead and create our new context. So I'm going to export const, and I'm going to call this to-dos context. And this will be create context. Now remember, I don't need to put anything inside of create context unless I want to use this context in a component that is not wrapped inside of our provider. Why would I want to do that? I probably wouldn't. I could just use a variable, like a constant variable somewhere else. No real reason to use create context unless maybe I'm writing some form of tests. So I'm going to keep that empty for now. And I'm going to create our to-dos provider. To-dos provider.
I know.
And
All
yep.
right. Sorry.
What?
Sorry,
For what? What happened?
I wasn't on mute and my phone
Oh.
was yelling.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no problem, Deja. Okay, so, and inside of my provider, I'm going to receive props. This is going to be just any other components that are wrapped within this. I'm going to go ahead and export it now. Default to-dos provider. I'm going to return something, which I don't know yet. Or maybe I do. I'm going to return my to-dos context. So I'm going to say to-dos context dot, and it gives me provider. So I have my to-dos context, my provider here, and it takes in a value. And whatever I put inside of here is what's going to be accessible to any components inside of here, which I will make by doing props.children. And so let's go ahead and have some to-dos. So I'm going to say const, I'm going to say to-dos, set to-dos. This is going to be from our use state. And this is going to initialize as an empty array. Now, for fun, I'm going to have it start with just a couple to-dos anyway, so it's easy for me to keep track of. So this is going to be an array of objects. This ID is going to be 1, and I'm just going to have this say body, and it's going to be buy milk. and completed false. Okay, and I'll do another one where the ID2, I'll say work out, complete false. So I just am putting in a couple things as a default state, right? Totally, I don't really need this, it's just there. But inside of my value, I'm gonna go ahead and pass to-dos, pointing to to-dos. Okay, so before I go any further, I'm gonna start to think about testing this. So I'm gonna go ahead and import this into my app.js. And right, this doesn't have to be inside of here. Now I could wrap everything in there. I could say to-dos provider, like so. I could do that if I wanted to, if I wanted everything to have access to my to-dos provider. Let me go ahead and import that. But I could also, if I didn't want those to have access to it, I could put things over here, right? I could have my own provider here. So these elements don't know about what's inside of here. That's totally viable. For now, I am going to wrap everything in just to make a point about something else in a little bit. So these will be indented more. Okay, so we've got our to-dos provider. Let's go ahead and make a to-do index. I'm going to go ahead into here. I'm going to make a to-dos index. So this is going to show all of my to-dos. And so let's go ahead and import React from React. I know I'm going to use context because I want to have access to my to-dos that are in my state. So I'm going to say use context. I am going to import my context. I know that as well. So I'm going to say to-dos. I think I called it context from .. provider / to-dos provider. And let's go ahead and make this component. So I'm going to say const to-dos index. And this is going to take in nothing because that's what we're going to use our store for. Export default our to-dos index. Okay. Now I can go ahead and make a UL. So I'm going to return some kind of UL. This is going to have all of my to-dos in there, but I don't have to-dos. So let's go ahead and pull those out of our context. So I'm going to say const. I'm going to destructure the amount of that object, to-dos, and I'm going to assign that to our use context. And I'm going to pass the context that I want to pull from, to-dos context. Now I should have my to-dos. And so I should be able to go to-dos.map. And those are going to take in a to-do. And I could break this into another component, but for just simplicity, I'm just going to make an li here. I'm going to give it a key, which is going to be my to-do.id. And I'm going to show my to-do.body. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and import our to-do index into app. So I'm just going to do this below our counter. And I'm going to say to-do and, oops. I'm going to say to-do index. And let's go see how that works. Oh, it flipped on me. Okay. And we see buy milk, work out. Cool. So we currently have access to all of our to-dos inside of here. So this is working. Now, if I wanted for some reason to add these to-dos, let's say inside of my counter, for whatever reason, how could I make that happen? Well, I would import to-do context, to-dos context from our to-do provider, and I could still go const to-dos And I would use context again. And I would say to-dos context, right? Because counter is inside of our to-dos provider. Right now, counter also has access to anything that our to-dos provide. So we are able to key into that context. And I can show you, I'll console log here, our to-dos. And you'll see we'll still have access to those to-dos, which are here. Okay. So that's kind of cool. The reason I wanted to show you this is because we also built this little example called class counter. So I'm going to import that as well in here. And I'll say to-dos counter. And I'm going to comment out that console log so it's not there anymore. And in our class counter, we can't just say static context type anymore. That no longer works. We can only do it this way one time for one specific context. This is why the hooks are super duper advantageous compared to what it used to be with classes. So if I wanted to use both classes, I wouldn't be able to use this line anymore. Instead, I would have to create what is called these kind of consumers. So I would have to say, let's say counter context dot consumer. So this is like different from we had the provider relationship. This is the consumer. And this is a tag like that. Let me just make sure I'm doing this right. Yep. And I could put things in here. Now this doesn't work exactly the way we would like because this actually takes in a function. So I would go like this and I would say I want our count and I'd have to put things like this. If I want to replicate this behavior, I would be saying, which I know is a little, if this is going way over your head, this is okay. I'd rather you understand it with hooks more than classes. But this is how it used to be written. And so this would be, I think, count dot count, because I'm calling it count. Let me just make sure that's still working. Class count is 0. Okay, right, so it still works. Now, if I wanted to have my second context in here, I would have to do this again. So I would actually have to go like this. To-dos context dot consumer. Pass this in to here. And this would also take a function that I would say to-dos. And inside of all of here is where I would be return. So I would return, yeah, all of this inside of here. And I would also have to be returning this. So you can see, so right here I can console log our to-dos, console.log to-dos dot to-dos. Okay. This is really ugly because it has so much nesting. Here, I can clean it up maybe a little, but let me make sure it still works. See, now we have all of our to-dos there that we're console logging, and we still have this count. So this is if you wanted to grab from more than one context previously with classes, this was the way to do it. really gnarly. And it creates this false sense of hierarchy where to-dos is inside of count. Therefore, count must be more important than to-dos. But it works the same if I were to reverse these. So it's not real. So this is one of the great additions to our hooks, because with our hooks, we don't have to write like that. The equivalent of this class component is this, which is just so much cleaner. So this is one of the great things with hooks, like really make using the context API just so much cleaner. Okay, so that's just a small tangential concept for you to be aware of when it comes to state. Now back to the main event. We've got our to-do index here as well as our to-do provider. So let's go ahead and add some functions here. So I'm going to add that const of our add to do, because we want to be able to add our to-dos and specifically add one to-do. And so with my single to-do, let's see, what do I really want to do with it? Well, let's give it an ID. So I'm going to take this to-do and I'm going to give it an ID. So I'm going to say to-do.id, and let's just give it like a v4. Let's invoke that. That's just going to give us an ID. Let's make it not complete. So I'll say completed is equal to false. And then I'm going to set my to-dos and add it. So I'm going to go ahead and go, okay, set to-dos. And I'm going to add this to-do. So if you remember, if I'm referring to a previous state, I should make that a function, prev to-dos. And this is going to return my to-do with my old to-dos. Right? All right. And now I'm also going to pass in here our new add to do. So let's go ahead and write a quick component that allows us to add a to do. So I'm going to make a new component. I'm going to call this to do form.js. And inside of here, I'm going to import React from React. I am going to const, I'm going to call this to do form. It's not going to take in any arguments. It's going to export default our to do form. And let's go ahead and get into it. So I want to have a body. So I know I'm going to need local state, because when our forms are being created, we almost always want to use local state. I didn't add something like that in a provider. This provider is only dealing with complete to-dos, not local ones. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say const body and set body. It's going to be our use state. Oops. So we'll start as empty. Let's go ahead and return some kind of form with an input. And our input should have a value. That's going to be our body. And we're going to have an onChange listener, which is just going to set our body. Set body to e.target.value. Okay, and our form should listen for an onSubmit. Or I'm going to call some function called handle submit. And let's go ahead and add that function. Const handle submit takes in an E. Let's just go ahead and give ourselves a little bit more space. First thing we'll do is prevent our default, because we don't want the page to refresh. Okay, and let's go ahead and add our to-do, right? So, well, how do we add our to-do? How do we actually add the to-do?
We need to get the function that we created in our to-do provider.
That's right. So we got to go get that function. So to get that function, we're going to have to use we're going to need to use context, and then we're going to have to import the context that we wish to use. So we're going to import our to-dos context. Thank you, Danny, for that help. And we will do / provider / to-dos provider. And let's go ahead and pull that out. So I'm going to say const add to do, because that's what I called it. And I'm going to pull that out of our use context. Right? This is so much cleaner than Redux. I hope someday that this is able to handle as much as Redux. For now, it's really not meant to replace Redux, but it's good for small little applications where you don't need to have a lot in your state management, which a lot of us do build small applications. You know, I know I'm definitely not building the next Amazon anytime soon, although maybe someday I will be hired by Amazon. Same for you. So we'll just add our new to-do, and this will be an object, and I'll have my body pointing to body. And then for good measure, I like to set my body back to empty because I don't want it hanging around. Okay, so we've got our little form here. I probably should add labels and whatnot, but I'm just not going to for time's sake. And inside of my app.js, let's go ahead and use that. So above our index, let's go ahead and bring in our to-do form. And let's go check if it works. Nope. To-do form is not defined. I guess I didn't actually import it. I thought it would import it for me automatically. It did not. So no problem. To-do form. We'll import it, and hopefully we have it now. And it looks like we got our little form. So let's go ahead and add something like eat ice cream. Everybody wants that. And it looks like it's showing up. Snack, run, do JavaScript. So that's working. Any questions on that?
Yeah, Corey. In my group, we were having a problem with getting the add to do function. It kept on, like, when we tried to use the add to do function, it kept on saying that it wasn't a function.
It sounds like maybe you were calling it something different in the value and the way you were importing it.
Can I see how you imported the add to do function real quick?
Sure. So I'm taking an add to do.
Yeah.
But that's also what I'm passing in to my provider inside of curly braces.
Yeah, that's exactly how we have it, but I don't know. Something's wrong.
Can we debug it after?
Yeah.
Okay. So I could add a delete to do. I'm not going to. I'll leave that up to you on your own time. Now, I'd like to show you. Let's see, what time is it? Okay. Yeah, I'd like to show you the next piece of information. So this is all well and fine, right? This is pretty great. This is like way cleaner or like easier to implement all of a sudden than it was with Redux. Although Redux is still great. Don't forget Redux. Don't leave Redux. This is just meant to show you another way to do some things with, right? So what's something that I might not like about this? Anybody know?
I was just about to ask you. I noticed that you did when you are creating a new context, or when you're calling the context, you're calling it twice.
When I'm calling the context, I'm calling it twice.
And I forget where. But you had the forget it. I was gonna ask you if there was a dry way of doing it.
You're not talking about when I did it like this, right?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Oh no, this is actually really dry and clean. This is because this is using two different contexts. This context refers to our counter context. This context refers to our to-dos context. It's like using use effect for multiple times. It's totally acceptable. I mean, compare that especially to the old way of doing it, where it would literally look like this.
Or that's
It's
nice.
just like, holy crap, this
Yeah.
is so clean. Oh my god, when it was like this, I didn't even bother to learn it. I was just like, no way am I gonna do that.
It's not easy on the eyes at all.
No, I mean, you can make it a little easier with implicit returns, right? I could get rid of that, get rid of that. Then I could get rid of that, get rid of that. So now I have an implicit return here. So that's like a little nicer. And I could do an implicit return here too. Although I can't because I need the console log. But yeah. I think I screwed up somewhere else. I'm just going to go back to where it was. Because it's not really the point of the lecture. Okay. So this is cool, but there's some things. Okay. Here's the things I'm not in love with. Every time I want to make a change to this to-dos provider, I create another function in here. Right? So let's say I also have const remove to do. This takes in an ID. We'll say, I might as well just write it real quick. And this is just going to be set to-dos to our to-dos dot filter to-do of to-do not equal to-do dot ID. Not equal to ID. Okay, so like, and then I would have to add that here, and I would say remove to do. And so I could have a few in here, right? I could also have toggle to do. I might have a lot of things, right? Especially if it's not just a to do app. And so every time I add something here, I also have to remember to add something here. Now, that's not the end of the world, but it could be cleaner. And so now I'm going to introduce something new to you. But it's not that new because you're familiar with Redux. There is a beautiful hook called the use reducer. Okay? So before we get into this, let's go ahead and add a new file or a new folder called reducers. What? Yeah, we have not completely escaped from reducers. And inside of here, I'm going to call this to-dos reducer. And I'm going to write this the way I normally write these. So I'm going to say const to-dos reducer. And what's a reducer take in?
Initial state and action.
State and action. That's right. Our state in this case, I'm not going to say what the default is right now. I guess I could. Okay, I will. Why not? I'm going to make that my array. Export default to-dos reducer. Now, this is going to work the same way as all of the reducers that we've been writing the last few days. So I'm going to say action.type. And for now, I'm just going to use strings because I'm a little bit lazy at the moment. But in real life, right, we would maybe make action types again. So to start, well, let's go ahead and just say add to do. And let's go ahead and add our to do. So I'm going to pretend that I actually taken the whole to do instead. So maybe instead of doing all this stuff, I'm actually do this stuff in the form. So I'm gonna replace that now just to be consistent. So in my to do form, so just small detour. In my to do form, let's import that, and I'm gonna have my body, my ID pointing to V4, and completed pointing to false, just to be consistent. And then in my to-dos provider, I'm actually not going to do these lines. Okay, so I'm just going to keep it like that. Sorry, just a minor change of where I'm actually doing it, because a reducer should be pure. So, okay, so now in the case that I want to add a to-do, I am going to return my payload. We'll say action.payload and destructure the state that I'm in. In the case that I want to, let's say, remove the to-do, I would just return my state.filter, where I would say to-do, and say to-do.id is not equal to my action.payload. Okay, man, this is kind of like Redux here. Return state. Now, the great thing about this is I could add things to my reducer here, but my provider doesn't really have to do much changing. So the way things are going to change now for our provider is, instead of having all this, I'm going to comment down all this stuff because we no longer are going to use it. I'm going to make a duplicate of this line so you can see what was there, but we're no longer going to use that. And instead, I'm still going to pass in my to-dos. Here, I'll show you. Hang on. We're no longer going to use state. So let me comment this out. But instead, we're going to use reducer, another hook. And in our use reducer, it looks kind of similar to what was there before. So we say const, it's going to give us back two things. So we'll say our to-dos, and then it also gives us back this dispatch. So we're back kind of in the reducer world here. And I'm going to say use reducer. And our use reducer takes in the reducer that we want to use. So in this case, we want to use our to-dos reducer. So we have to import that. So I'm going to say to-dos reducer from // reducers / to-dos reducer. So I can take that. That's the first argument into our use reducer. The second argument is any default state that you want. So if I want this state that was in there previously, I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in. Now I can pass in here my to-dos and my dispatch. And this component no longer needs to make any changes. So I can change things in my reducer all I want, but I don't have to change anything in this provider. So our app still should look the same here, where we have all of our to-dos. However, when I try to make a new to-do, so when I say eat, we're going to get this error because we don't have add to-do. It's not a function that's being passed anymore through context. So what is being passed through context? Does anybody know?
Dispatch?
Sorry?
Dispatch?
Dispatch, yeah, exactly, right? Now we're passing to-dos and dispatch. So we can go back up to our to-do form. And instead of taking out add to-do, which is what was there previously, here, I'll make a duplicate line for you. Now we can take out dispatch. And so instead of doing add to-do here, we really just want to dispatch, and dispatch takes in an action, which is an object, right? Actions are objects with a type property. So I could say add to do here, and it said we gave it a payload, which in this case would be this object. Let me see, is there a way for me to make that look cleaner? There we go. And let's see if that works. So now, when we refresh, small issue. Unexpected add to do. What is wrong?
The parentheses.
Should it be on the outside of the curly
Oh,
bracket?
you're talking about right here, yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. So now when I say eat, we dispatch that action. So that's kind of cool. To take this really a step further, right? We could do the same thing that we do for Redux to stay really organized, and we could make a folder here called actions. Inside of there, we could make action types. Action types.js. And inside of here, we could say export const add to do is equal to add to do, right? And so in my reducer here, I'll import that instead. Import add to do from our actions. So this is no longer a string. Right, and of course I would do that for this as well. And then let's also make more actions, right? Just like regular Redux here, we can make a file, and I could call this to do actions, lowercase probably, to do actions.js. I can import the same thing.
Corey, so what's the whole point of using Redux if we're gonna do Redux without installing Redux?
Well, what do you mean? What's the whole point of using Redux?
Not all right. I'll take that back. Now, what's the whole point? But like, why install Redux when we can use Redux here? And use
So Redux is phenomenal for big applications. There's a decent chance that if you get hired at a big app company, they will use Redux. Redux is really good for fast and regular updates to application state. Context is good more for something that is global all around. But there are some similar patterns just because these are like more best practices than rules. As you saw, we already had it working with the use state and things like that. But this is the best practice. This is like how I could clean this up. It does fall a bit more of a Redux pattern, but that's nice because that's what's familiar to a lot of people. And it's really clean, all these separation of concerns. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
No problem. So we'll import that. And so let's also go ahead and make our action creators. So export const, I'm going to call this add to do. And this is a function that takes in a to do. And this is going to return a payload, an action where my type is add to do. And my payload is to do. Now, what do I really need to do now? Now in my add form, I no longer need to import, I no longer need to dispatch all this because I have a function for that. So I'm going to go ahead and say like my const to do is equal to this. So I'm going to take this just for clarity. And I'm going to import my action creator. So I can go ahead and import my add to do from /action/ to do actions. And now I can do it just like Redux. Dispatch, add to do, pass in my to do. And now we can, extra semicolon. Now we can still add our to do, which is pretty cool if you ask me. That's like really cool. Shower. And look how clean it is. Right? We've got this to do. We're dispatching our add to do. Dispatch, we're just pulling it out of use context now instead of use dispatch, which and we're saying what context we want. Remember, we can also still pull out our to-dos in there because those are the two things our provider's passing us. It's providing us our to-dos and our dispatch. So in our to-dos index, we still can pull out our to-dos from our context. And in our provider, though, now, in our to-dos provider, we are going ahead and making this value. Instead of use state, we're using the hook use reducer, which takes in a reducer as its argument and an initial state. I'm just happen to be setting things in there because I want things already in there, but this would be our initial state. And then our reducer, though, is our regular old reducer that we've seen, where it's just a switch statement, takes in state and an action, looks at the action type, case of what, do this, case of that, do this, so on and so forth. Any questions on that? I'm sure we have some.
Can you just quickly go to the to-dos provider page? I just want to take a look at it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to move these out just so we can actually see it. Just so like we can really see the impact of what this is doing. Really keeps it clean. Right? And clean programming is like the best program. You want your programs to be as clean as possible because it makes it way easier to debug. It makes it way more readable. It makes it so much easier to add new things to it. An example of that, I built a game a while ago. It was that maze game where I had all these different levels, and I wrote it so messy the first time, like super duper messy. So much so that I had to specifically say which level to go to next within that level. And it was like, it's kind of hard to explain, but I had like all this duplicate code and it was really messy. And if I wanted to add another level, I would have to probably add about 500 lines of code. Because it was just like a mess. I spent about a month, 2 months refactoring that code so that it was really object oriented and had each maze just as inside of an array. And all I had to do was build on a maze, which is just like an array of arrays with symbols. And I could add that into my maze array, my level array. And that was all I had to do then. It was like, it completely changed how easy it would be for me to add a new level. Because which I didn't have the first time at all. So the idea is you really want to keep your code clean because right now if we wanted to add a toggle to do, I wouldn't have to write it in here and then add it in here and then find somewhere else. Instead, I would just create my new action, add it into my reducer, and then I could just go ahead and dispatch it. What else? What other questions? Can you combine reducers like a root reducer? Great question, Doug. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, you could definitely write your own combined reducer. It's not too bad. I've seen the source code for it. Otherwise, I guess you could use Redux, but then you're really using Redux. If you're getting to the point where you have to combine reducers, you may want to start thinking about using Redux instead of React Context API. What if to-dos were an object? My to-dos are an object, Kevin. Maybe you could clarify.
Isn't your initial state like an array of objects?
Oh, I see. What if it was an object of objects or something?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. So if it was an object of objects, that's what this to-dos would be. So just like my use selector, I would probably be grabbing like object.values of to-dos. That's probably what I'd be mapping through. And then in my reducer, instead of using like array method here, and putting this in an array, I would have to think about doing it a little bit differently. I would probably do it the same way we did it in the other to-do app that we built. Let me see if I can find that. ls to do cd into to do walkthrough, because I think we did an object of objects in this one. To do reducer. Our reducer would probably just look like this. Same kind of thing, where we would say new state, let's do the spread operator there, receive to do, which would be my new state, the payload ID is equal to a payload, and just add that new key into there. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah.
I would probably just literally rip this code and shove it into our new other project.
All right.
Cool question. What else? Any other questions?
Hey, Corey, quick question.
Yeah.
So before you did like the everything in your reducer,
Yeah.
you had the previous function that did the same thing that you're returning right there in your case when
Yep.
you prev state. So did we have to use prev state? Couldn't we just have like spread it just like that?
Yeah, technically that would have worked as well, I think. You're talking about right here, right?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah,
saying
right.
we could do set to do's and say to do to-dos. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Let's put down all this weird crap that just randomly filled itself in. Yeah, I think that would work too. I didn't do it that way, mostly just because whenever I'm operating on the belief that anytime you refer to the previous state, you want to include that as a function. So that way, if multiple calls happen at the same time, it won't skip over something. It will happen in the order that it was called in, because this is still an asynchronous function.
Okay.
What else? What other questions do we have? Okay. So let's try it in your breakout groups. Let's go back to the counter example and see if you can update your counter example to be using the use reducer. Okay, any questions on that? And I will push the code. right away. Okay. All right. So let's do this for. Yeah. Let's go for 10 minutes. I guess. I know it's not a lot of time, but just give it a shot. Okay. All right. See you in a bit. Hey, Maria.
Hey. Hey, Jay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, hi, other Jay.
I just want to welcome the show exactly who the first J is.
Yeah.
I'm calling everybody by their last name for a while. I don't even know the J's first names anymore.
Are you doing anything special, Fowler? Tomorrow?
All right. I'm sorry.
I don't think anybody's gonna remember.
Oh, I remember.
I remember, my friend.
I remember.
I just got here, but I also remember.
You will
remember.
Maria.
Tomorrow is your birthdays.
Oh, word!
Remember.
Virtual birthday punches?
We
I'm
will
joking.
definitely have to sing virtually. But before that, we got 4
Birthday
minutes
shots.
left. I want to do this quick. Just with your thumb, can you give me a thumbs up for how that went? Thumbs down, thumbs to
I'm
the
gonna do
side.
like thumb down here to the bottom right of the screen, right about here.
Okay. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs. All right. So we got 3 minutes. I'm gonna try to kind of like walk us through it. But maybe it's more like run us through it. Okay. So screen share, desktop 2. Let me know if for some reason you can't see it. I don't know why these keep moving. It is like the most biggest pet peeve. All right. So inside of our to-do counter provider, right, we need this new reducer. So I'm going to go ahead and add that first. So I'm going to say counter reducer.js. And inside of here, let's go ahead and just export default. All right, whatever. I'll just write it the long way. Const counter reducer. And this takes in our state, which I'm going to initialize at 0, as well as our action. Whoops. I'm going to export this, export default our counter reducer. Okay. I'm also going to make our new action types. So I'm going to have an increment and a decrement. So this is going to be increment. This is going to be decrement. Okay. And inside of my counter reducer, I'm going to use that. So I'm going to say switch and action dot type. And I will say increment. And I guess I need to import those still. Import increment and decrement from our /action types, right? And so in the case that I want to do that is I want to return our state plus 1. In the case of decrement, I want to return our state minus 1, right? This is just how I want to handle our state. Otherwise, I want to return state. Let's go ahead and import these into our counter provider. So in our counter provider, I'm going to import our reducer, import counter reducer from /reducer/ counter. Oh no. Counter reducer. Okay, and then so I'm also going to use reducer Oh, it is 10. Okay. Well, I'm just gonna finish up this one.
Keep going. Keep going. You got
Okay,
one.
so I'm gonna say we want our
I ain't gotta do it, bro.
dispatch. We'll take down our dispatch as well as count. This is gonna be use reducer, and that's gonna take in our counter reducer, and our initial state of 0. I'm no longer gonna pass these in, and instead of this, I'm gonna have my count as well as my dispatch. So now, just because we're almost there, I'm so sorry for going over this one time. In our counter updater, I am going to pull that out. So instead of increment and decrement, I'm going to call dispatch. And I'm going to, in the invocation of a function, I'm going to increment dispatch of increment, which we don't currently have this function yet, but we can in just a second. This is only going to take about 2 more minutes. Dispatch decrement. So decrement. And then let's also just go ahead and make those actions really quick. New file, we'll call this counteractions.js. We have to import the same stuff that we did in our reducer. So I'm going to import increment, decrement from /action types, export. I'm going to call this increment. This is a function that is just going to return this object with type increment, and this will be the same, but for decrement and type decrement. And now inside of our counter updater, we
Line
will.
3, you spelled increment incorrectly.
Did I? In counter actions?
Yeah.
Thank you. And then in our counter updater, we'll import those actions. So I'm going to say increment, decrement from / action / counter actions. And that should be it. So we have that. We have our plus working and our minus working. Okay. Cool. Okay, so have a terrific night. I will push that code. I will stick around for a while, for a little while at least, and answer any questions. Everyone else, yeah, I know my spelling is terrible, Deja. Everyone else is free to go. You can start your work on your lab whenever you've got free time tomorrow. If not, we'll spend all day in class working on the lab. It's just the context lab. I wrote, I'm pretty excited about it. But other than that, so I mean, if you're not doing anything tomorrow at lunch and you want to code, do the context lab. But otherwise, you'll work on it during class. Okay?
Thank
Awesome.
you.